Okay, so we're over here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, right? And we're finishing it up. And so just as is always, we'll start the whole thing out by looking at the full breakdown of the book. And so if you break it in half, you have, what's the first section? Chapter 1 through 6. Okay, and the second section is chapter 7 through 16. And then you split that in half there. And so chapters 1 through what are one section? 1 through 4, and that is what? It's going to be division. It's going to be the division issue. Yep. It's going to be that division in the church. And then chapter 5 through 6. You even have the cheat sheet up there. First section is only 1 through 6. Chapter 5 through 6 is what? That's immorality. Okay, and that's the section on immorality. Okay, then moving over to the second section, you have chapter 7 through 7 is marriage issue. Okay, and so you're going to deal with all the details with that. Then chapter 8 through 10. Yep, chapter 8 through 10 is going to be what? Meat and idols. Okay, yep, meat and idols. And chapters 11 through 14 are what? Worship. And then chapter 15 is the resurrection, okay, all by itself. And then chapter 16 is all by itself. It's the conclusion. Okay, great. Okay, so in chapter 3, the big issue that we're dealing with is Paul as a preacher. We've dealt with the preaching. We've dealt with the way Paul preaches. And now we're dealing with Paul as a preacher. And the sum of the whole chapter on the thing is, how important is a preacher? He's not important. He's just not that big of a deal. And he uses several different analogies for it. He uses the idea of a plant growing. And if you look at a plant growing, what's the really powerful thing of a plant? It's the seed. And he says that seed is what does the work, and it's that seed that gets the credit. And he says in this case, the seed's going to be the Word. It's going to be God's Word. And so that's the powerful thing. That's the heavy lifter. That's what's doing all the work. Now Paul, he did do an important thing. He went and took that seed and he stuck it 2 inches down on the ground, right? He just went, boop. And that's a big deal. Because if you don't do that, what happens? Nothing. Seed doesn't grow. But putting it down there is not the powerful thing, right? It just is opening the door for the power to come through. I guess you kind of compare it to like a dam. You know, you have a dam and it's holding back all that water, and then when the water starts getting high, they may say we need to release some water, and so they go and they turn a crank, and they turn some crank and open up a valve, and all that water comes rushing through. Now, what's the powerful and magnificent thing in that? It's the water rushing through, isn't it? I mean, that's where all the power is. That's what floods towns. That's what destroys bridges. I mean, the water's got the power. But it did take that guy to turn that crank to open that dam, didn't it? And so Paul says, yeah, I'm important. I have a value. I got that thing started. I was the one who planted the seed in your hearts. And then he says, then another guy came along and he watered that seed. Now, who's the guy he uses in that analogy? He says, it's Apollos that did that. So Apollos came by and watered. And once again, that's a big deal, right? Because if you plant the seed, but you don't water the seed, nothing happens. But it's not the guy watering that is the important thing, is it? See, everything keeps coming back to that seed that grows into a plant. And so Paul says, now that's really the way it is. So what I do, it's important. But it's only important because I'm helping people get access to the thing that will grow inside them, right? And you see this over and over and over and over and over again. That when people are converted, there was somebody who started it, right? There was somebody who got that ball rolling, who planted that seed. But if you think back on the people who plant the seed, it's amazing. You look 10, 20 years later, a lot of times people will tell their story of who it was that taught them the gospel originally, and they don't even live in the same state. Sometimes they don't even live in the same country. So it's not the person who taught you first that's important, is it? It's the seed that they plant in your heart, which goes with you wherever you go. So if I learn the gospel in Montana, and then I move to Idaho, or I move to Florida, or I move to Germany, the person who taught me is still living in Montana, aren't they? But the word they taught me, where does it go? It follows with me, doesn't it? It goes everywhere I go. And so Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but who gave the increase? God gave the increase. So that's that first analogy he gave. And then the next one is, he gave an analogy of a building. And he says, now I'm like a builder. And like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation in you, and that foundation is Jesus Christ. And we talked about in length on this because it's really important to understand if somebody's foundation is not Jesus Christ and His Word, are they saved? There's no way to be saved. Christ Himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me, right? So you take Christ out of it, you take that foundation away, and now you're back really to the story that Christ gave of the man who built his house upon the sand and another guy who built his house upon the rock. What happened to the guy who built his house on the sand? Storm came and whole thing washed away. So Paul starts this analogy by saying, now we're not talking about Christians and non-Christians here. And it's really important to understand. I laid a foundation, and the foundation is Christ. So the building, and he's going to say the building is you Corinthians. That building is built on Christ. So everybody there is a Christian, right? We're not talking about non-Christians and Christians. We're just talking about Christians. And he says, now here's the thing. Here's that foundation that you all have, which is Jesus Christ. Now he's emphasizing Jesus over and over and over again, and the Word, which is a seed, and over again. He's emphasizing that because where have they been putting their trust? They've been putting it in men, haven't they? One guy says, I'm of Paul, and I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Apollos. So he's emphasizing that. Now the foundation is Christ. Now you build off of that, and different people can help you build off of that. Now, when Apollos came along, Paul laid the foundation of Christ. And Apollos came along and he taught those Corinthians. Did he help them build on that foundation? Yeah, he did. Apollos definitely helped them build, didn't he? But he didn't help them build on a different foundation. He didn't start a different house, did he? He started on that same foundation. That foundation is Christ. And then he says, now if you go through, and this just tells you how important things are, you go through, and he says, now let's take, and let's just light that place on fire. So you just take and you're going to light that thing on fire. Let's assume that's a torch. And you take and you light that house on fire. Now what's going to burn up? Everything that's of a burnable quality, right? So the bricks aren't going to burn up. Concrete's not going to burn up. But the wood's going to burn up. If you built that house out of straw, it's going to burn up. Now, his whole point in is, now we're going to talk about how great preachers are. This is his whole point. Preachers are just so great. What happens if you get somebody and they become a Christian, they say, I'm going to do what God says. And they get in a congregation and they start building off that foundation. Now, they are Christians. And they're going to take and get help from whoever they can get help from, right, to build off that foundation. Isn't that what we do? We become Christians and then we just start looking around for help to grow. Well, what happens if you get somebody who helps you grow and say you have your own Apollos? Now, Apollos, it says, was a very eloquent man who knew the Scriptures, smart guy, worked real hard, very devout. Say you get a guy not like Apollos, but you get somebody to help you and you follow them and they're teaching the truth, but they're just not very good at it. Now, So you got a Christian, and they're out in the middle of Timbuktu, and they don't really have a whole lot of Bible knowledge. They know what it takes to become a Christian. They know the basics, but then, they've got somebody who they're studying with, and they're helping them build, but they're not doing a great job, which, let's be honest, that happens sometimes, doesn't it? I mean, honestly, sometimes we're the ones helping them, and we're not doing a very good job, right? Somebody comes to you for advice, and you look back 10, 15 years later, and you say, that was the worst advice I could possibly have given them, right? I mean, we do that. Okay, so now, you go through, and you burn up all the wasted time, all the bad advice. Are they still a Christian? That foundation's still there, right? And so Paul's saying, if we're talking here, now you can do some good things. Now you should try and build off that foundation, shouldn't you? Just like Christ says, store up treasures for yourself in heaven. You should try and build off that. But let's just take worst case scenario. You have somebody, and they spend their whole life, they become a Christian, and they spend their whole life just kind of going back and forth, and just nuttiness, and they're just struggling to hang on. And we've seen Christians like that, right? I mean, you see it where people just hanging on by their claws. And they never get very far. They never grow very much. Okay, that's the worst case scenario. So you say, what'd they build on it? Well, they built a little hut out of straw, out of playing cards on the foundation. That's what they built. Okay, when that person dies, where do they go? Where do they go? They go to heaven. That's the big deal. They go to heaven. Now you have another guy, and he's not that way. Now he works real hard, and he gets his act together, and he works, and he builds a giant stone masonry mansion on that thing. And the fire comes through, and it's going to burn up some of the stuff he has in there too, right? But not as much as the guy who built the house out of straw. But at the end result, where's that guy going? Heaven. So now, why do both of them go to heaven? Where'd they build their houses? On Christ. So now, we're going to talk about the important thing. Is the important thing that I listen to the way Paul preaches the gospel, or I listen to the way Apollos preaches the gospel? Is that the important thing? Well, the important thing is that foundation, isn't it? And that's his big point on the subject, is that, look, it does matter how you build. I mean, it does matter that you work and you study and you grow and you become mature. How many verses are there out there that talk about Christians should grow and mature? Just over and 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 over again. So we're not going to say that it's not important. And he even points that out. Look, on the day, in the trials of tribulations of life, in the day of judgment, if you built poorly, you're going to suffer loss. That's what he says there. You'll suffer loss. It's going to hurt you. You think, I wasted all those years in vanity. I wasted all that time on this or that. I should have gotten my act together. It's going to hurt. But you're still going to go to heaven as long as that foundation is still Christ. And so 1 Corinthians 3, his whole point is Paul is a preacher. And Apollos is a preacher. And Peter is a preacher. And they're all preaching the same foundation, aren't they? Jesus Christ. And then Apollos gets up and maybe he gives 50 sermons on grace. 50 different sermons on grace and love and God's kindness, and he gives 20 different sermons on how you need to become a better person and how you need to work harder. Now Paul comes in, and Paul's always kind of seemed like a little bit tougher guy than Apollos to me, and so Paul comes in and he preaches 50 sermons on you need to work harder, you need to get your act together, you need to do this, you need to grow, and he preached about 20 sermons on grace. So one guy listens to Paul and he says, I really work on kind of person I'm becoming. Another guy listened to Apollos and he hears that emphasis Apollo has, and he goes, boy, I'm going to work on being more loving and more kind and more gentle and more peaceable and sharing that grace that God has given me. And so that's where his focus is. And let's be honest, preachers have focus, don't they? I mean, it just happens. It's not even a conscious thing most of the time. And so one guy focuses on this, and another guy focuses on this, and so you can see how those two guys could get to arguing, couldn't you? The guy who listens to Paul says, boy, you need to get your act together. You are lazy. You are not working hard. You are not learning and studying the Scriptures. I mean, you got problems. And this guy over here says, you're mean. You're nasty. You are just too tough on people, and God loves you. And now, do they both agree that you have to work and that God gives us grace? They both agree on it, right? But one says, I like Paul's emphasis more, and another says, I like Apollo's emphasis more. How much is that going to matter in the day of judgment? Not one whit. Not one bit. Nothing. And so his point is the foundation is what matters. Is Christ divided? Remember how we started this whole thing by saying, is Christ divided? Absolutely not. So how important is a preacher? Oh yeah, he can do some things for you. He can teach you some things. He can bring to mind some verses for you. But at the end of the day, it's that foundation. It's Christ. Will you serve Him? Will you let Him be your guide? Will you do everything in your power to do things His way? To trust in Him. Follow His pattern. Be faithful to His Word. That's what matters. If I have that attitude, and I go out and work on being more gracious, another guy goes out and works out on being more zealous, does it matter? It doesn't matter one whit. And so that's Paul's point. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. So then he says, verse 16, do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Now that is a very important thing. Now he's building off of that building idea. Now he just got done talking about the building in terms of what's the important part of the building? Foundation, right? We hammered that point. Now, Paul does this over and over and over again through the Scriptures. He'll take one idea, and he started this idea by talking about, well, here's a building, and a building has a foundation. That's the important thing. And now he's going to go talk about that building, and he says, now you are a building. And he's going to talk about another aspect of it. Whose building are you? You're God's building. And he says, so now if I am God's building, if we are God's building, if someone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. Now, that's not him just saying an idea. That's the truth on the subject. In the Old Testament, when they had a temple, when they had Solomon's temple, an actual temple, if a guy came in there and tried to defile the temple, say he brought a pig in and he thought he'd just offer it on the altar there, what would they do? What was a Jew told to do to a man who would do that? You kill him. You put him to death. Any man who would defile the temple, you kill him. So he's not saying something here that is an opinion. He's saying this is what we already know to be the case. And he says, now the temple's different nowadays. You are the temple. You are the ones who are supposed to be building yourselves off of that foundation of Christ. You are supposed to be building your lives together in unity in Christ. You are supposed to be working and growing and becoming stronger and serving God and being a place where you are a living sacrifice to God. Every day, just like the temple was. Think of what the temple was in the Old Testament. It was a place of worship, wasn't it? It was a place where people went and they saw that gold structure. They saw all the things. They saw the choir singing and the harpists playing, and they just, hear God. God is great. That was the whole point. He says, you are that temple. You are the thing that should make people go, God is great. There's something different. You're the light unto the world. Isn't that the way Christ puts it? You're the salt of the earth. He says, so now here it is. If you Corinthians are that temple, you are that structure of God, if someone goes in to defile the old structure, we'd kill him. And he says, so now if somebody defiles this structure, in other words, if there's people in there trying to cause trouble, cause division, if there's people in there trying to tear the church apart, trying to pit you against each other and not be peaceable and not loving and get you to follow man instead of God, what's God going to do to him? God will destroy him. Now that's a big, big warning there, isn't it? Now, Paul's been going through and he's been pointing out this idea. He's been saying, now look, you've got divisions and whatnot, but for the most part, he's been giving them the benefit of the doubt that they just don't get it. But there's a little shot across the bow that just says, look, if somebody in there is purposely and insidiously trying to tear you apart, God's got your number. There's no room for that kind of behavior. And so that's a real big warning. That's a scary thing, isn't it? Think how serious God was about protecting the physical structure of the temple. How much more so is He about protecting the church, His people, unity? It's a big deal to God, unity. And there's times where we're going to have to fight some things out, right? I mean, if there's a doctrinal thing, if somebody starts tearing away from the foundation of Christ, that's different. But in general, the battles that happen in congregations, they're not over doctrine. Oh, eventually they kind of start to be over doctrine because somebody will find something and kind of try and use that as their poking stick, but it rarely starts that way. It almost always starts because so-and-so doesn't like so-and-so, or somebody didn't say hi to somebody, or somebody was rude to so-and-so, or you didn't hold my baby, or you did hold my baby. Or, I mean, on and on and on it goes, right? I mean, so his point is look, you need to watch it. We need to watch our attitudes. Because when we are talking about the church, we're not talking about just any old group of people. This isn't like a sewing club. Right? It's not like a swim team or something. It's not just, well, it's no big deal. This is a organization ordained by God and protected by His might. And so he says God will destroy them. And that's where you see other verses like James talks about, a teacher incurs a stricter judgment, right? Because if a teacher comes in there and he finds a crack, and if you're looking for cracks in a congregation, you can find them, right? You can either find them to mend them and patch those seams, or you can find them, stick a chisel in there and just work it through. He says, now, teachers, you're in a great position to do one or the other, aren't you? And so he says, if you're the kind that has a chisel and you're trying to work those cracks open wider, God's got your number. And so he says, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. Now, this is a really poetical way of saying this. Now, this sounds like chapter 1, doesn't it? Remember how chapter 1 he did that whole wise and fool thing, back and forth, wise, fool, wisdom of the world, and then the foolishness of God, and back and forth. And his whole point of that was, when we get really wrapped up in knowledge of this life, we're going to miss the gospel. So here, he's talking about division, isn't he? And he says, let no one deceive himself. If you really think you're smart, if anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, which Paul's already told you how much he cares about that. Not a bit, right? And so if anybody thinks he's really smart, I'm paraphrasing here. I'll paraphrase it in kind of modern English. If anyone thinks he's really smart, let him be a dumb person so he can start learning something. If you're really smart, you'll listen to what God says. And that's the truth of the matter, isn't it? See, sometimes we get so full of ourselves, oh, I know what I'm doing, this, here, that, and we get our opinions, and our opinions get in the way, and our opinions cause division. Almost every time you see division in a church, it is because somebody got an idea, and their idea is so important to them. Either an idea about the color of the carpet, or an idea about some doctrine, or an idea about how they feel about people, or an idea about what the preacher ought to dress like, or whatever. They get some idea in their head, and they say, I know what I'm doing, and they get really built up around that. And that becomes their Gatling gun, doesn't it? And they just fire that wherever they think. Well, what's Paul's point on that? He says, opinions don't matter. If you really are smart, if you're a really smart person, you'll shut your mouth and listen to what God has to say. And that's the truth on the matter. The truth is the only way we'll really become wise and able to do good things is if we'll just listen to the Scriptures and take our opinions out of the thing. Everybody who's ever obeyed the gospel has at some point shut their mouth. Right? I mean, you have to. Right? At some point you got to listen and do less talking. And so that's his point here. You had division. And Some of you had division because you got caught up in it. And some guy said something and you thought it was a really good idea. Oh, yeah, well, I really do like Paul, so I'll say I'm a Paul. And some of you just kind of went along like cattle. But others of you are deceivers. Others of you got a taste of power. You shut your mouth and you listen to what God says. And so Paul, like every other letter written in the Bible and every other apostle that speaks, has a very strict attitude towards false teachers, doesn't he? This is one of the things that just has hit me over and over and over again, that I am not firm enough on false teachers. Because every time I think that I'm starting to really show my fangs, I'll go and read a verse and I go, well, he was a lot meaner than I would have been. It's just kind of amazing. Now, there's a point for diplomacy, and he uses a different tone with people who are false teachers outside of the church than he does with people who are false teachers in the church, right? Because you don't know, if somebody's a false teacher outside of the church, you don't know whether it's out of ignorance or out of purpose, do you? But if they're in the church, I can tell you, it's not ignorance, because they know better, right? If they're in the church, they know better. And so he's really firm on it. And Paul feels like a lot of times the hard preacher, but then go over and read Peter's letters on the subject, and Peter makes Paul look like just a baby comparatively, because Peter's really hard on false teachers. And so, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. Shut your mouth and listen up. Verse 19, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. Now you go in and you say, I have 9 PhDs and I know what I'm talking about and I'm real smart and I can use big words. How much does God care about that? He can care one bit. Is there any big word that you got that God can't think of a bigger one? Is there any eloquent preacher out there that God can't be more eloquent? Or we're just a joke, right? And so, for it is written, He catches the wise in their own craftiness. Boy, you think you're so smart. So, you hear these guys sometimes, right? And they get to where they weave this kind of political web with their speech. And boy, it sure sounds fancy and it sounds good. And it says here, what can God do to a guy who's crafty in his speech? God's going to catch you. It says God will catch the wise in his own craftiness. He'll get you. Don't think you're so crafty you can fool God. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. There's no argument you can make that He hasn't thought of. You're not going to trick Him. You're not smarter than Him. You're not going to come up with something where He goes, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. God is better at wisdom than you are. So it doesn't matter what area of life it is, if your opinion is what you're planting your feet on, you're in trouble. Do not plant your feet on opinion. And so on matters of doctrine, you plant your feet as hard as you can, right? You don't move an inch. When it's a doctrinal thing, you don't move 1 millimeter. If it's a thus saith the Lord, you just stay put. But if you can't find a thus saith the Lord, what do you need to do? You just move with the tide. You just got to go with it. And in other words, if it's not a big deal to God, then it's not a big deal to us either. Or at least it shouldn't be a big deal to us either. But that's a hard thing, right? That's a hard thing. You have these cultural things and these tradition things and these things that we like, and they're important to us. And somebody breaks those traditions and whatnot that we're used to, and we get really fed up really fast. Right? I mean, if I came up, this is probably a bad example, but if I showed up on Sunday and I came in jeans and a t-shirt to preach, how many people would be upset about it? Yeah. See, I'd be upset about it too. But if we're going to be technical about it, is that the kind of thing that we should really plant our feet on as the hill to die on? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't say something about it, because I would probably say something to that guy too about being respectful and getting along with other people. But I'm saying, is that choice going to send that guy to hell? If I come in blue jeans and a t-shirt to preach, am I going to hell because of that? No way. But let's be honest about it. How quickly do we get worked up about those things? They're just kind of important to us. Not scriptural a bit, but they're important to us. And so we have to draw that line. Therefore, verse 21, therefore, let no one boast in men. Isn't that the whole point of what he started out with? See how I keep going back? And there's a reason I've been doing this. Every time we start the class, I say, now remember what he's talking about? Division. He's still dealing with that, isn't he? Therefore, let no one boast in men. That's the same issue he started chapter 1 with, isn't it? So he says, therefore, let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. Now, this is an interesting way to look at it. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all are yours, and you are Christ, and Christ is God. Now, think about it this way. Let's go back to that picture of that plant growing. Now, the powerful thing in that analogy is what? It's a seed. So that's the powerful thing. Okay? That's the thing that changes your life. That's the thing that makes you better. Now, here comes Paul, and Paul plants that seed. So here's Paul right here, and he just drives that in. And Apollos, he comes by and he waters. Now, I guess the way to think of it is if you think of it from the standpoint of the plant that's growing, you have a farmer out there. You know, you have a farmer growing corn, right? So let's just take Steve and Oliver, and they've been out there growing corn this last year. How much attention did you guys give that corn? Enough to make it grow good. I mean, anytime those plants look like they needed some water or some fertilizer, anytime you just had the slightest inkling that maybe that's not right, maybe we're going to... How much time did you guys think about how far apart you'd plant the seeds? So you thought about those things, didn't you? Oh, no, don't want to plant them too close, because then we'll have to uproot a whole bunch. Plant them too far away, we're wasting the dirt, and we want to get more in. So every stage of it, fertilizing, planting, watering, all of that stuff, who's serving who? Now, we normally think the crops are there for the farmer, but let's be honest for a second. The farmer's there for the crops, isn't he? Who's the servant of what? The corn gets everything. It's just like it's at a corn hotel, right? They're just butlers bringing by whatever they want. Would you like a little more water? Would you like a little fertilizer? Oh, sure, just whatever you need. They don't even have to ask. They just get a little wilty. That's Paul's point. He says, look, you say, I am of Paul, or I have Apollos, and you're saying we attach ourselves to this man or that man, and when you do that, if I say I am of Paul, where am I in relation to Paul? Who's greater, me or Paul, if I say I am of Paul? Paul is, isn't he? I put him above me, haven't I? Now, the truth of the matter is, he says, all things are yours. I've got a better deal for you. Instead of you all saying, I am of Paul or I have Apollos, and you start boasting in men, how about you do this, and you just say, look, they're all servants of us. Because that's the truth of the matter. We all belong to Christ, and every single one of those men, Peter, Apollos, Paul, they're servants of us. Now think about it for a second. Isn't that exactly what Christ told His apostles they would have to do? Remember, He went and washed their feet, didn't He? And He said, you all have to do likewise. And He told them, He said, the Gentiles, the rulers of the Gentiles, lord it over them. But not so in my kingdom. He who wishes to be greatest will be servant of all. The truth of the matter is, in the church, the apostles, and they were the servants. Who was there for who? Were the Corinthians there for Paul, or was Paul there for the Corinthians? Paul was there for the Corinthians, wasn't he? How about Apollos? Who was there for who? Did the Corinthians come to help take care of Apollos and give him anything he needed? Or did Apollos go to the Corinthians to give them everything they needed? He says, we're your servants. And now, we're your servants, but we all belong to who? We all belong to Christ. So Christ is up here. We're not going to take that away. But don't put me up there. Don't put Apollos up there. If anything, you put us under your feet. Because we're the ones washing your feet. We're the ones caring for your needs. We're your servants. How many tears did Paul shed over Corinth? Masters don't shed tears over servants, do they? Servants shed tears over masters. And so Paul's point is, all things are yours, whether it be Paul or Apollos or Cephas, that is Peter, or the world. Now, let's think about this for a second. Why is this planet here? Why God make it? He made it for His people, right? Now, it says He did it for His good pleasure, right? It's created for Him, but why did He create it for Him? What was the special thing He put in this world for Him? Us, people. So now you go around as a Christian, and you really have got it right. I mean, in other words, you are the thing that God really wanted so bad He'd send His Son to die for. How much of this world is yours? He says, it's all for you. This whole world, it blows my mind, really, when you think about it. But this whole world is here to bless us. Everything about it, just everything about it. Every animal, every molecule, every star. I mean, you look out and you look at all those stars. And everybody says the same thing when they look, go out to real dark night sky, not these city skies we got, but you go out to the rural skies. You go and see it dark. And you look out there, everybody does the same thing. Wow. Now, why do you say wow? Because it's pretty, isn't it? Why did He make it pretty? For His good pleasure and for those who were made in His image who could appreciate the same things He appreciates. So you say all things are yours. Paul, Apollos, Cephas, let's go even farther. How about this whole world? Who's it here for? You. And now all mankind gets to enjoy the blessings of this world, but who really gets the most enjoyment out of this life? Christians do. They're going to get the most out of it. Right? I guess you kind of compare it to like, eating ribs. You have some people, they eat ribs and they get most of the meat off and then they throw it away. And then you have someone like I have an uncle and, he eats rib and there's nothing left, right? I mean, there's just nothing left. He gets all of it off. Now, everybody in this planet is blessed. God says He has the rainfall on the righteous and the unrighteous, right? But who gets every little morsel out of it? Who really gets the real joys out of it? I was thinking about it this morning. Got up this morning, went to breakfast with some Christians, which we have a habit of doing every morning before services. So went to breakfast, spent half hour joking and laughing, all clean. There's no pain in it, right? There's no offensive thing. It's just wonderful, happy time together. Then I come to services, spend services with people that really matter to me, people who have the same goals and priorities as I do. They love the Lord like I do. I get to sit here and think about God. And I get to, in my specific case, I get to work a job where I get to feel like I make a difference because I get to preach God's Word. Boy, life is good. Now, I can tell you I am getting more out of my Sunday than some guy who's hanging out at the bar. Right? Now, he's getting something out of life. He's breathing. He's got some blessings. But I'm getting the whole rib. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Cephas or Apollos or the world or life or death. Now, I'm just pausing on these things because I want you to really think about it. This is an amazing thing you got. See, this is talking to us, isn't it? Life. Now, I guess it's kind of that same idea. I mean, there's life and then there's life, right? There's living and then there's really living, the good life. I mean, there's where you wake up and you've got a reason to take a breath and you've got hope and you've got purpose and you've got value and you know why you're here. And it's not that you don't have problems. Christians have problems all the time, but you've got hope through it. And you keep going and there's a value to it and you've got life. All things are yours. Life. How about death? Now, death is something that 99% of mankind thinks is a very horrible, despicable thing that we don't want to talk about, right? That's what death is. It's a bad thing. That's when you give up all the fun. That's when you're dead. As the atheist says, you're dead all over. How about a Christian? When a Christian approaches death and they get really dwelling on it, they can embrace it, can't they? They say, I'm going home. So, even in death, you're blessed. Or things present, or things to come. All are yours. It's everything that's going on now. Why does God have the world here now? Why doesn't God just destroy the world today? Why hasn't He just wiped it out like He says He's eventually going to do? Why is it still here? So that people can obey the gospel, right? It's for Christians. For Christians now and for Christians in the future. So, all things present, you say, why is there still air circulating in the world? Why is there still energy here? Why hasn't everything been destroyed? Christians. Things to come, or the future of this planet, and then the eternal future, and the eternal heaven. Why is that stuff there? Why were all those things being made? Christians. And so you look at Christ and you say, well, everything's for Him, but what does He do with everything? He keeps giving it to us, doesn't He? He's this truly loving and generous God who says, all things are for me and all things are created by my good pleasure, and so now just let me pass everything I've got down to you. It's just an amazing thing. And so Paul says, look, you're sitting here arguing over petty things. I mean, when you put it in that perspective, isn't that the just most petty thing you can imagine? They're sitting here arguing over which guy's the best. When you've got life, you've got death, you've got everything waiting you. Things present, things to come. The whole world is there for your taking. You've got servants who'll serve you every day with teaching and ministering to your spiritual needs, and in me and Apollos and Cephas. I mean, we've laid the whole thing out for you. We're like your butlers. You've got all this, and you want to argue over which guy's better. Now that's petty, isn't it? How many times do we get petty? How many times do we live our lives and we get so caught up in one little thing or another, get distracted from the goal, get distracted from what's important, and get caught up in vanity? See, it scares me. It scares me how much of life and the good life that the Lord has for me that I miss out on because I get caught up in some little petty argument. Somebody said something mean to me, and so I just sit there and stew over it. And just worthless. And yet we do it over and over and over and over and over again. And so his point is, look, all things are yours, and you are Christ, and Christ is God's. And so if you belong to Christ, how much protection do you have? And if Christ isn't strong enough for you, who does Christ belong to? The Father. So you got it all. You've got everything you could possibly imagine. Every blessing that God can pour out, He's willing and ready to pour out on you, and He'll protect you from everything. Makes you think about David writing about, though I travel through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, right? God's just this bubble of shield and protection around us. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Just one observation first. When you make all this analogy, I think it really goes back like everything is ours. It just reminds me of the sermon on Matthew 5, who said, "You're the salt of the earth."
Mm-hmm.
Salt is also savor. So really, everything is ours. But if we're going, what is God going to keep the earth for? He's not.
He's not. Yeah.
And then, back where it says the Spirit of God that dwells in you.
Mm-hmm.
I just think when you really think about it, the way you made the analogy of the Word
Mm-hmm.
planted in us.
Mm-hmm.
So the Word, the Spirit of God is the Word in us. And I think you go along with that.
Yeah. Yep.
Many people take this another way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, when you talk about the Spirit of God dwelling in us, I think it always comes back to that word. And it's the same idea as where Christ says the kingdom of heaven will not come with seeing, for the kingdom of heaven is within you. Well, that tells you the kingdom, the church, it's a nation, right? The kingdom is the same as the church. It's a nation. Well, where does that nation get its power? Where does it derive from? It doesn't have a physical military, does it? It doesn't have physical boundaries. Where are the boundaries of, if you're going to draw the land, that the kingdom of heaven, the church owns, where are you going to set the boundaries? He says you're going to set the boundaries around the human heart. That's where it is. And so it's when that word dwells within our minds, within our hearts, that's when the Spirit of God is in us. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you look at that, and that's the teaching on it. That's the truth of the matter, is when you put it in context. He's talking about the Scripture. He's talking about when you really listen to what God says, then He'll start to dwell in you, and you won't have this backbiting and infighting and problems. So, yeah, very true. Okay, chapter 4. Everybody ready for chapter 4? Any questions on chapter 3? Okay, so chapter 4, Paul's going to talk about himself as, I guess you could say it's Paul's apostleship, or you could just say Paul the human. Paul the man, I guess, would be the way I tend to think of it. Is chapter 4, he's going to talk about who he is and why he is who he is. Now just remember, the past chapters, the first chapter, he says, this is what the preaching is. The preaching's the important thing. Chapter 2, he says, this is how I preach it. And the way he preached it, he says, is in meekness, in weakness, and fear, and trembling, right? In other words, it's not great preaching that did the whole thing. Chapter 3, he says, I'm a preacher. And how important is a preacher? Not. You're just not. You got a job, and it's important, but it's not that big of a deal. And then chapter 4, he's going to talk about who he is and why he does what he does. Now, the reason that's important is you have people out here, once again, the problem is you have people going, I'm a Paul and I have Apollos. And they're venerating these guys. They're putting them on a pedestal. And Paul needs to explain that's not what he wants. In other words, if you really want to make me happy, you won't worship me. If you really want to fulfill my heart's desire, you won't worship me, you'll worship Christ. Which that's true of every faithful Christian, isn't it? You don't want the power, you want good done. In other words, he says, this is my life's work. This is what I've dedicated myself to. And so Paul's going to go on to talk about what it means to be him, what his apostleship is, what his life as a Christian is. What is it he really, really wants? Because if you can get an understanding of how Paul thinks and who Paul is, well, then you're going to stop trying to treat him like he's better than somebody else and equal to Christ, aren't you? I mean, if you really want to make Paul happy, the last thing you're going to do is say Paul is equal to Jesus. Because you know that's not going to make Paul happy at all. So he's going to spend chapter 4 talking about Paul the man. And of course, he'll bring in other guys too. He'll talk about Apollos and that sort of thing. But his point here is he's talking about himself and what really is important to him. And so he says in chapter 4, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Now really, if you want to sum up what Paul's life's really about is what? I want to serve. I'm a servant. I'm a steward of the mysteries of God. Now, the mysteries of God, he talked about that back earlier. The mystery of God is that which He has revealed to us through His Spirit. It's the Word of God. So when he says the mysteries of God, now, as a matter of fact, let's go back and take a look at that real quick. Go down to chapter 2, and he says, chapter 2, verse 7, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory. And in that whole chapter, he's talking about the Bible, the New Testament concept, the story of Christ, which that's God's wisdom, but it's always been a mystery up until now, right? Up until this point, have even the angels known what Christ was going to do? No, so it's been a mystery. So he says, we are servants, and we are servants of Christ. I'm here to do Christ's bidding. So first of all, if you say Paul is equal to Christ, that's not going to work because Paul says, I'm a servant of Christ. I'm lower than him. And we're stewards of the mysteries of God. We're here to reveal truth to you. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. You could spend so much time on this one verse. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of sermons I could preach on verse 2. It is required in stewards that one be found faithful. How many things are you stewards of? A steward is when somebody gives you something and you're supposed to take care of it. So how many things has God given you? Okay, let me ask another question. How many things has God not given you? Everything that you've got is from God, right? So now you are a steward because He gave it to you. If you get a $5, if I walk up to Betty right now and I give her $5, now I gave her $5, but where did she really get that $5 from? She got it from God, right? So now, as long as she's got that $5, she's got to be a steward of it, doesn't she? Because it's something she was given by God to have for a time. So now you're going to have to be faithful with it. Because that's what a steward has to be, faithful. So then you have kids. So you say, I'm going to have some kids. And so you have 3 little kids, all the same age. And you've got to deal with those kids. Now guess what you have to be? Faithful. Or say you have 1 little kid. You know, it doesn't matter what you got. No matter what you have, if you have a lot. See, remember Christ telling the parable of the talents? One guy had 5 talents. One guy had 2 talents, and one guy had 1 talent. Now, the guy who got in trouble was a 1-talent guy, right? Did he get in trouble because he had only 1 talent? He didn't use it wisely. That's why he got in trouble. If the 5-talent guy had come back and not used his 5 talents wisely, he would have gotten in trouble too, right? Had nothing to do with the amount he was given. It had to do with whether he was faithful with it. So you have to think about those things in every aspect of your life. And of course, the most obvious ones are things like parenting or our monetary things, our homes and our cars and our finances and whatnot. But, you look at your marriages, that's certainly an issue. You say, well, what about my relationships with other people? How many times have we said after somebody was converted, it's so funny. They showed up at just the right time to meet that person who taught them the gospel. Are your relationships a stewardship given to you by God? They are. So now, what's the one thing that a steward has to do? Be faithful. You see how I said I could preach hundreds of sermons on this? Because every area of your life, you've got to ask yourself, am I being faithful with this thing that God's given me? If I go to work, am I behaving as a steward of that job? Not only am I being careful to work hard and earn the money, but am I also behaving in a way that God wants me to? And you think about, had somebody ask a question and say, well, my boss keeps wanting me to lie to them. Lie for them, not to them. Lie for them. And so they want me to go and lie when I go to work and, to say things about the accounting or say something about, no, my boss isn't really here or something like that. They want me to lie. Now, that job has been given to you. Has that job been given to you by your boss? It's been given to you. See, that's why I told Betty, if I give Betty $5, she's going to say, Scott gave me $5. And that's the way we think, right? And just like if Betty gave me $5, I'd be thinking Betty gave it to me. But in truth, if we're going to get real technical on it, you trace it back to God. So who gave you that job? God did. Now, your boss wants you to lie. But who's your real boss? God. So if I'm going to be a good steward who's found faithful of that job that God gave me, am I going to lie? But see, that's a hard thing to do, isn't it? Especially when you think, I might lose this job. But remember Esther? Esther's a great example of stewardship. Go to Esther, and Mordecai went to her and said, how do you know that you were not put here for such a time as this? But he might kill me. The king might kill me if I go do that. If he kills you, he kills you. You are here. Why have you been put in this position? Why are you queen? Who's given you this stewardship? God did. And so you just go over and over and over again. Paul says, look, I'm here just to be faithful. That's the most important thing in my life, is that I can walk away and say, God, the things you gave me to do, I did them. I did them to the best of my ability. I worked as hard as I could. I was faithful. I was careful. I was diligent. Which is exactly why when Paul found out churches were doing poorly, that he'd cry over them, wasn't it? See, the normal reaction if you had a bunch of people acting like idiots, which is exactly what the Corinthians were doing, is to just say, I'm done with you, right? Paul's over at Ephesus at this time, and things are going great there. Look, I don't want to deal with you lowlives. I've got good things over here. See, that's a human way to think. But Paul cared about it because he says they're my stewardship. I have ability to make a difference with them in a way that nobody else could. Nobody else could have written that letter. Paul was the only guy who could have that kind of impact, and that's why he cared about it. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know of nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. Now, this is a huge concept, one of which I am really horrible at obeying. Paul says, I don't really care what anybody thinks of me. I don't care whether you judge me or whether I'm even judged in a physical court before kings and princes and rulers. I don't care. In other words, Paul says, if you take me to the Supreme Court and they all say I'm a liar, a cheater, and a thief, I don't care. And he says, and if I go into a city and everybody in the city says I'm a liar, a cheat, and a thief, I don't care. And if I look in the mirror and I feel like a liar, a cheat, and a thief, I don't care. Because the only thing that really matters is what God says about me. See, he says it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you, that is that public opinion, what people think of me, or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. So does Paul even care about what he thinks of himself? Now, this is a very important thing because a lot of times we are our own worst critics, aren't we? I mean, this is why we find this all the time where people have, I guess in just a purely physical example, how many people look at themselves in the mirror and say, I'm just a really good-looking dude? See, what's the first thing you see when you look in the mirror? All the things you don't like about yourself. And you know, when I give a sermon, the first thing I'm thinking about when I get down from the pulpit is all the things I said wrong. It's a very natural thing, and I think it's extra normal for Christians to do this. Because Christians are trying to examine themselves. That's something the Scriptures tell us to do, right? At least once a week you're supposed to examine yourself. So you get in this habit of examining and looking and churning over, am I being the kind of person? And we tend to get really, really critical about it. Oh, I could have said that better. Oh, I could have said that. Oh, I should have done this. Or I wish I wasn't so dumb. Or, whatever it is. And we get that, if you ask Helen Williams, she'll say it's self-talk. That's the term she uses. You get that self-talk going. And it tends to be junk self-talk. And Paul says, I don't care what everybody else says. I don't care what even the rulers say. I care what God says. I don't care what I say. He says, for I know of nothing against myself, yet I'm not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord. So Paul says, how do I know whether I'm doing things right or wrong? Does it matter how I feel about it? He said, no, it just matters what the Scriptures say. Now you take a Christian, and you put them in an environment where they're the only Christian. They're not married to a Christian. Their kids aren't Christians. They go to work and they're not working with Christians. The only time they're able to be around Christians is just every once in a great blue moon, right? They can come to services and but in other words, they're surrounded by people who have different priorities than them. How quickly is their self-esteem going to go down? They're going to get hammered every moment of every second of every day, aren't they? Just beaten on. That verse is for that person. Say, look, you're doing the right thing. I know you don't feel like you're doing enough. I know you don't feel like you're working hard enough. I know you don't feel like you're faithful enough. But God doesn't care. God says you're doing it. And it doesn't matter how you feel. Because feelings are deceptive. See, feelings can be deceptive in the sense of I think I'm something special, right? Ooh, I'm real important, and my feelings can deceive me that way. But when I think I'm nothing and I'm useless and I'm not good for anything, that can be deceptive too, can't it? See, it goes both directions. So Paul says, I've just learned, and it is a learned trait, to step back and say, all that really matters is what God says. Anybody have any questions? Okay, what we'll do is we'll stop there, and we'll pick up down in verse 6 next week.